Hey, welcome back. J.P.s World of Wrestling. Your man J.P. What are we talking about today? Well, today we're talking about this guy, the Nature Boy Ric Flair. Why are we talking about Ric Flair? Well, because last night I watched a documentary called WOOOO Becoming Ric Flair on Peacock, and I gotta say, it was amazing. To me, it was one of the most well done and well made wrestling documentaries I've ever seen. And but first, let's talk a little bit about my memories of Ric Flair. My memories of Ric Flair date back to I think 1988 or 89, and I was sitting in my bedroom, and I had cable TV in my room. And so one Saturday morning, actually it was Saturday afternoon, I was flipping through the channels, and I came across NWA Wrestling. And at that point, I had only known about WWF. I only knew about the WWF. I was a WWF guy. But I came across this guy. Ric Flair was their top guy. He was their multi-time world champion. He wore the finest clothes. He rode in limousines and Lear jets and wore Rolexes and fur coats. And, he had all these women and stuff. And he was drinking every night and then going in the next morning to train and then be at the match to wrestle every day. And, he was kind of that type of champion. And he was part of the Four Horsemen, which was him and Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard and Ole Anderson, and then later on guys like Lex Luger and Barry Windham and Sid Vicious joined, and I think at one point Paul Roma joined, and then later on, eventually like Steve Mongo McMichael and Dean Malenko and Chris Benoit, those guys. But the one thing that was always a constant was this guy, Ric Flair. In my opinion, this is the real Ric Flair action figure. That WWF one, I'm not even going to show that one. That one's a joke. That doesn't even count as a Ric Flair figure. This is a Ric Flair figure. To me, this is the Ric Flair action figure. This is one of the greatest action figures ever in professional wrestling. But the documentary, it talked about his early life. It starts off talking about kind of how he was born and how there's some things that not many people know about his birth and how, his real name, Richard Fleer, was not even really his real name. Like he was born with a different name. And that there was some stuff that went on. And, well, you should watch the documentary to find that out because I don't want to ruin anything for you. But, it talks about how he got into wrestling and wrestling for Vern Gagne and then wrestling for Jim Crockett and then how and why he moved to the WWF and then went back to WCW and then eventually back to WWE, and he kind of ended his run in WWE. And it talks about that and even talks about his final WWE match against Shawn Michaels, which that was a really good match. If you haven't seen it, you should check it out. But anyway, Ric Flair, probably considered by his peers probably the greatest wrestler that ever lived. He's a 16-time world champion. He's done it all. And a lot of wrestlers talk about how really great he was in the ring. And I liked him. I always liked Ric Flair. I never had an issue with Ric Flair. I never had an issue acknowledging that he was the other big star in the business besides Hulk Hogan. And then finally, when Hulk Hogan went to WCW, this guy and Hulk Hogan finally went one-on-one on a pay-per-view. That was the main event. Ric Flair versus Hulk Hogan for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. And I think it was Bash of the Beach. But that was a really good match. That was an epic match. But the problem with Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair is, from what I understand, when Rick was in WWF, the WWF audience didn't really know who Ric Flair was. So to them, that wasn't really an epic match. And then when Hulk was in WCW, the WCW people, they were Ric Flair people. They weren't really Hulk Hogan people. That kind of came later. But eventually, especially when Hogan turned heel, I think people finally started realizing, Hogan's a big deal and Ric Flair is a big deal. So having those two guys wrestle is a big deal. And I still think that Ric Flair versus Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 8 would have been phenomenal. But I'm not in the wrestling business. I'm not a booker. I'm not a writer. I'm not a wrestler or referee. I'm not anything. I'm just a guy that sits here and does silly wrestling videos for you. But in my opinion, that would have been an epic match for WrestleMania. That would have been, to me, the ultimate WrestleMania main event. But then again, I was a guy that watched both WWF and WCW. I was a fan of both. So to me, that would have been like the ultimate clashing of the two biggest companies in wrestling history. So, Ric Flair, woo! Becoming Ric Flair on Peacock. I highly recommend it. I highly, highly recommend it. And I think if you're a wrestling fan, if you're a Ric Flair fan, or even if you're not, even if you just like interesting documentaries, I would check it out on Peacock. Woo! Becoming Ric Flair. That's gonna do it for today. Now, I apologize if it seems like there's like kind of a gap in time between these videos. Right now, it's kind of hard to record videos because I have to do them around my work schedule. In fact, I got to go to work today, but I have to do these like kind of on my off time. And sometimes during my off time, I've got other stuff that I have to get done, and it just I record them when I can. But I'm going to record them as much as I can so that I can bring you the content that you want. And so coming up on my channel, hopefully I'm going to have some more matches. I'm going to set it up. I'm going to pick sort of 8 guys. Or actually what I might do is I might sort of remind you guys of the collection that I have of the Hasbros and Galoobs and Mattel Retros. And then you guys can maybe pick like 8 guys. And then I'm going to have maybe a tournament or some way I'm going to determine a champion. I am going to determine a champion of the channel. So watch for that. So if you're new here, like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.